Brussels Bites, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Center with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi, welcome back to the Martin Center podcast on technology and European policy. My name is Dimitar, and after a short break, we're back to Brussels and back to basics. Back in the bubble of funny abbreviations and constant political drama. In today's episode of Brussels Bites, we're going to focus on personal data, privacy, and data governance. A topic that we all agree is extremely important, and yet we're not really certain what to do about it. How do we safeguard personal privacy? How do we handle our own sensitive data? And let me add this. These issues are so tricky that we're not even certain whether the word data is used in the singular or plural. Data is, data are, I don't know. So I'm really happy that today we have an expert to shed some light on these complex issues. It's a pleasure to be joined by Valentina Pavel, who is a digital rights policy advisor and a former Mozilla Fellow at Privacy International. Valentina recently released her fellowship project called Our Data Future, where she explores different data governance models and imagines how the world might look like in 10 years from now. She's also a core member of the Association of Technology and Internet, or APTI, in Romania. This is a digital rights organization which is part of European digital rights. Valentina, it's a pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Hello, Dimitar, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Right, so before we jump deeply into these issues, I just want to ask you, maybe you can tell us a bit more on your work in Privacy International and the last couple of months or last 1 year of your project.
I was a Mozilla Fellow at Privacy International, and it was an absolutely great experience. PI is working on a lot of issues such as corporate data exploitation, challenging government surveillance, and defending democracies. They are looking at issues around exploitation of data in elections, and they launched a number of campaigns on political advertising that challenged the ad tech industry. They revealed how mobile apps send data to Facebook. And more recently, they wrote how menstruation apps collect and use your data, but also how mental apps treat personal information. During my fellowship there, I focused on the concept of data ownership, and I explored different proposals connected to this model. And I looked at the implications for privacy stemming from concentration of corporate power. And as you mentioned, my fellowship output is the Our Data project, where I imagine how different data models create different futures. It's an open invitation for everybody to explore what's the data future we want to live in, and how do we get there. Aside this work, I also monitored the GDPR implementation and examined derogations for political parties, especially in Romania. And I also looked at the tracking ecosystem.
Great. Speaking of privacy, I'm really tempted to share an immediate thought with you. Whenever somebody speaks on this topic, or whenever one of the big tech companies speak about privacy, a quote pops in my mind. It was a while back, maybe even 8, 9, 10 years ago, when Mark Zuckerberg said that privacy is no longer a social norm. It was one of his flagship statements at the time. Of course, in recent years, he backtracked on this statement. But can we agree that privacy is no longer a social norm? I mean, many people are advocating that transparency is extremely important, that, if you don't have anything to hide online, maybe we should be a bit more transparent, and this is going to make our society better. Would you agree?
For me, privacy is about freedom. And I want to be able to choose what information I want to disclose, to whom, in what conditions, and what information I want to keep private. So for me, it's a matter of agency and choice and not about hiding. And nobody enjoys feeling exposed and surveilled and threatened. And being under constant observation makes you self-censor, makes you behave in the way other people or bodies or authorities want you to behave. So that doesn't mean freedom for me, and that doesn't mean privacy. And it's not a healthy way to develop as an individual if you don't have freedom and dignity. And if I were to ask you now, would you give me your bank account and your PIN number?
I would say no.
So I guess everybody has something that they don't want to disclose or share immediately.
Especially when we talk about private lives and sensitive information. But indeed, one of the big questions is how to actually safeguard our privacy. That's number one. And secondly, what to do with our personal data. And our data right now, we supply to apps, to big tech companies. And many people say, well, I'm giving my data for free. I'm not getting anything in return. So a couple of people recently, a couple of proponents have put forward the following idea. Maybe we should get paid for our personal data, right? I mean, we are creating this value, so we should get something in return. And I'm giving this example because I saw a couple months ago an online letter you wrote to Will I Am. This is the hip hop star of the Black Eyed Peas group, who a couple months ago, I think in the World Economic Forum in Davos, was a very strong proponent saying, hey, personal data is part of my human rights and we should get paid for personal data. He was very strongly advocating that we should get something in return for the personal data that we're creating. And you yourself wrote a letter objecting to this, saying that we should not get paid for our personal data. Why?
Well, let's look at the problems. We're not happy that companies are exploiting the data we generate for their own profit and interest, right? Nobody's happy about that. We all see that they're becoming a sort of new feudal lords and they're building data monopolies. And we feel helpless about this. We don't have any mechanisms to defend ourselves, to stop this phenomenon. So yes, it's very intuitive to say, if big companies make a lot of money, I want a fair share of the profit. But if we want to challenge monopolies and their business model and make it right for everybody, I think we need to think in practical terms. Does the simple fact that a company gives me a certain amount of money, does this challenge their data practices? Does this stop data exploitation? Does this transform their business model in any way? And in my point of view, I don't think that happens. What happens is it reinforces the same old broken model. It makes them more greedy. They need to make more profit in order to pay us something. And only big companies afford to pay certain amounts of a certain amount of money to people.
And a follow-up, can we actually estimate the price of data as a little mental exercise? It's very easy to say, let's get paid for our data, but can we actually put a price tag on it?
Well, if we look at the Cambridge Analytica example, in their records, you can see that they paid 0.75 cents per user profile.
So less than 1 cent?
Yes.
Okay, zero, okay.
0.75. And that money represented name, surname, and... wait a second, location and personality traits, political involvement.
So less than 1 cent, even for my personality traits. These are the big 5 traits, which are the biggest predictor of human behavior and personal character, correct?
Yeah.
Wow, less than 1 cent, okay.
So does this make sense? Do we want to give away our most intimate data for a few pennies? Is it worth it? Did we consider the long-term implications of this? Because we need to remember privacy is a time-shifted risk, and this means perhaps information that you're okay with sharing today might not be a good thing to share in the future. And also, if you want to sell your data, this is a one-off transaction. You cannot undo it. It's something that doesn't go away, and you do not have any control after what happens after that.
Sure, but even if we're not paid for our data, speaking about apps and digital companies, social media platforms, maybe actually it makes sense that we're not getting paid for our data because we are using the service for free, right? This is our access, our data is our access to the service, correct? And many people are happy with that. Do you see a problem with this transaction?
I don't think we're considering the long-term implications of this. I think we're immediately going after convenience and ease of use. But at the same time, we're not aware of what happens in the background, where perhaps we are aware of the data that we directly give to companies, for example, our posts, our photos, our email accounts. But there's a lot of indirect data that is collected by companies. It can be location data, it can be our browsing activity. And there's very little transparency around this. So
even after all the scandals and all the publicity.
Exactly, and we don't have a clear picture of what's happening in the background. So how can we ask for a price when we don't even know what data is exactly collected about us?
All of this you mentioned is part of your project, Our Data Future, envisioning scenarios in 10 years' time how to actually govern our data. So if this is a problem, if maybe getting paid for our data is a bad thing, what solution would you put forward?
So I explored different models. I looked at property rights for data. I looked at being paid for your data. I even imagined how a national data fund system could look like, where data is controlled by both governments and citizens. But my conclusion was that we need a stronger data rights framework, a framework which is built on strong data protection regulation and fierce enforcement, but it's also complemented by open standards, by interoperability, by efficient data portability. And I think if we accumulate all these elements, we have a better chance of living the digital future that we want.
So you mentioned data rights. Does this mean that the current data rights we have, the current legislation we have, is not sufficient? What else do we need then?
I think the current data protection system is a very good start.
Okay.
I think it has very important elements in it, and I'm specifically thinking of principles such as data minimization to collect as little data as possible, principles of privacy by default and by design. But I think you need to add to this strong technical standards that are built in an open way for different, for example, centralized applications to talk to each other. I don't see any reason why I cannot talk to you or link my privacy-friendly app to your closed source application that you use for instant communication. And at the same time, decentralized systems can talk to each other as well. So I guess the big vision around a data rights framework would be to build this open interoperability standards and make the entire ecosystem talk to each other.
Sounds great, but how do we actually do it? Do you think the current big digital companies will share this idea? Are they going to implement it? Is self-regulation going to push forward such visions, or we need stronger regulation coming from national or European level?
I think there's a great initiative in terms of building these standards. It's a new vision for the internet and for technologies. At the same time, I think the big tech companies need to wake up to this reality, and it's our job to demand this on them and to put a lot of pressure. But yes, it's not gonna happen overnight. It's a long battle ahead.
And browsing through your project, you mentioned that some of the smart digital devices, such as Alexa or Google Assistant, just to name a couple of examples, you label them as surveillance machines. Why? Aren't these smart Internet of Things devices improving our lives, helping us to be more optimized and more productive?
If they are improving our lives or not, I think it's for each and everyone to decide. But I think what we need to understand is the implications of such devices and their long-term impact. And for me, this is key. And I'm coming back to my answer around freedom. I want to be aware of what's happening in the background, and I want to know exactly what type of data is collected, in what circumstances. I want to be able to stop it if I don't want that to happen. And this is not possible nowadays, or it's very difficult, even though data protection regimes such as the General Data Protection Regulation includes the right to ask for your data or to intervene or to make companies stop their collection practices. It's a very cumbersome effort from the individual side. So this is where other principles from the GDPR need to be pushed forward and need to be in the highlight in terms of business practices. And these principles are around privacy by design and by default, and around data minimization. I think this should be the core of all types of business processes, and user rights are added on top of that, but not vice versa. The individual should not be responsible for micromanaging every data transaction related to him or her.
So you're saying that these essential principles are embedded in the legislation. They're there on paper, but maybe they're not implemented rigorously enough, and maybe we should reinforce them, correct?
Yes, I think we have a long way to go in terms of implementation efforts and applying not only the letter but also the spirit of the law.
It's been more than a year since GDPR kicked in. There's numerous even analysis and even complaints that GDPR is not really doing a good job, especially coming from business. Surprise, surprise. But maybe focusing on GDPR and its implementation on the ground, what's your impressions? Are the data protection authorities doing a good job? Are people's rights being safeguarded? Do we see progress 1 year after GDPR kicked in?
I think we see slow progress, but it's a good start. I think we should expect from regulators harsher fines and rapid intervention. And linking back to your question around Alexa and Google Assistant and other smart devices, For example, the Data Protection Authority in Hamburg forbidden Google to make recordings from these types of assistants. So it's not a definite, it's not a final decision, but it definitely triggers an alarm bell for all types of companies that are doing similar practices.
Mm-hmm. And also following up on the question of GDPR implementation on the ground, an example comes to my mind, especially in Central and Eastern European member states. There's big concerns from watchdogs and NGOs basically saying that actually GDPR can even be used negatively. As an example, to stifle journalists, to also the data protection authorities, which are supposed to be independent, working on a national level. If they're not fully independent, they can even cooperate with governments, and they can be used as a tool of oppression towards smaller firms or companies to which the government or specific people in power are not very favorable. Sounds a bit gloomy, but that's the political reality in some European member states. So we should also take this into consideration.
We already have an indication that the GDPR can be misused as a tool to limit freedom of expression and of the press. And this was reported in a letter to the European Data Protection Board by the Association for Technology and Internet, by Privacy International and European Digital Rights, and other civil society organizations. And this referred to the RISE project case, where the Romanian DPA asked for the source of journalistic information. And this was based on the Romanian implementation of the law, which introduces derogations for processing of personal data for journalistic purposes. And the law mentions only 3 very limited scenarios under which personal data can be processed for journalistic purposes. And generally, processing of personal data for journalistic purposes is much wider than that. So I think the European Data Protection Board and the European Commission have plenty of opportunity now to ensure that the GDPR is not misused, particularly when it comes to freedom of expression and reconciling privacy and freedom of expression. And also to assure a uniform application of the GDPR at European level. And I think the RISE project context gives very strong concerns as regards to the independence of the Romanian Data Protection Authority. And it is absolutely unacceptable for a DPA to ask to disclose the source of personal data that reveal journalistic sources and access to journalistic data, which can represent a threat to freedom of expression and information. So borderline GDPR should not be used as a tool to silence freedom of the press or a way to block the publication of public interest information.
Exactly, and that's the thing with such an important legislation as the GDPR. It's very easy to label it as black or white, as successful or unsuccessful, but the reality is that on paper, this is a sound piece of legislation, but its implementation across the EU varies. Different member states implement the legislation in different ways, and there are certain loopholes. And we absolutely have to address this, and I think it's up to civil society, it's up to NGOs, it's up to academics to constantly put pressure on this topic. And I'd just like to ask you additionally, because I mean, you've been part of different campaigns and different initiatives, how to make people care more about their privacy, how to push privacy further up the political agenda. Is it through involvement? Is it through campaigns? Is it through education?
I think you need to do all of that. And I think you need to disclose different practices. For example, how political parties use your data for their campaigns, That's why I think Privacy International's campaign and work around data in the context of electoral processes is extremely important and extremely crucial in our times. We have national elections coming up in a lot of countries. In Romania, we have presidential elections in 2 months, and we have a very problematic loophole when it comes to processing personal data by political parties. And in the Romanian implementation of the law, political parties can simply process any type of data, including sensitive data, without consent or other legal basis.
And this is perfectly legal, according to your Romanian law, national law, correct?
Yes, that basically means legitimizing Cambridge Analytica. I followed up with an official complaint to the European Commission in February this year. So we're 6 months in after I sent this report and analysis, and nothing happened. So I really urge the European Commission to step in and assure cohesive implementation and application of the GDPR.
So there we go. Pressure should come from different levels, not only from top-level politicians, but also from civil society and from organized interest groups who are advocating for this. You raised a topic about elections, which reminded me of something also very interesting and a bit worrying. We live in a digital age in which more and more funding is invested towards digital communication, digital advertisement for political parties, specific spread of narratives goes online on targeted online campaigns. And yet, when it comes to accountability and transparency of all this money, all of these efforts online, it's like we're stuck in the beginning of the 20th century, because we have national laws giving specific boundaries for the money you can spend in newspaper ads, television ads, radio ads, accountability, right of appeal, and so on. But when it comes to digital, it's like we haven't made much progress in the last 10 years. I think even the United Kingdom Electoral Commission has been urging for the last decade that the UK should revamp and update its legislation when we talk about digital advertisement. Do you see this as a problem during national election campaigns?
Absolutely. I think we really need to do a revision around electoral law and how this relates to political campaigning. More and more political parties go in the online space and use sophisticated methods to send their political messaging and to do targeting and profiling. And these practices need to be exposed. We do have some first tools for more transparency, and I'm referring to different ad transparency registries launched by big tech companies. They're not extremely easy to use at this moment, but so there's a lot more to be done. But I think we need to take all this collective effort and do a revision of the electoral law system.
Do a revision of the electoral law system and maybe stop legitimizing Cambridge Analytica, as you just said. Valentina Pavel, thank you so much for being part of our podcast program. Dear listeners, the political season is in full swing in Brussels, so stay tuned for more content and more Brussels Bites.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bites.